There are two sayings in motorsport. One is that F1 is just if spelled backwards, and the other comes from the great Murray Walker. Anything can happen in Formula 1, and it usually does. And even today, where Formula 1 is considered boring compared to the so-called good old days, you should always expect the unexpected. But I've mentioned the if word a few times on the channel, and I gave some examples last time out, or just before that. I actually don't remember because everything just blurs together. How many years have I been doing this, and how many videos have I actually done? You know, such examples include, what if it started raining 5 minutes later at Interlagos? What if Damon second-guessed that move on the Michael at Adelaide? What if there were barriers at Hockenheim in 1968? And so on and so on and so on. But in the last lot of those, I did mention, what if Mansell's tyre held on a bit longer? Because that was one major development of the 1986 Formula 1 season. And since I don't know a lot about that race or that season because I wasn't born, incredibly, I thought I'd cover it today because the ending to that season was described as colossal. Mansell and Williams are one of Formula 1's great combinations, like Schumacher and Ferrari, Senna and McLaren, Clark and Lotus, and Hamilton and Mercedes. Those long-standing iconic partnerships, and in Mansell's case it should have been a bit better than it actually was. Now for a time, it seemed like Mansell would never win a title, and in the future perhaps I do need to do one of those retrospective videos on him, because I don't know much about his wider career, and like I've done with so many other drivers, we need to see if his statistics tell the whole story. This was the man who was told by his team boss at Lotus, "You will never win a Grand Prix for as long as I have a hole in my arse." But after joining Williams in 1985, Mansell was eager to prove himself against 1982 world champion Keke Rosberg, and the two got along well, with the FW10 they had that year getting better and better as time went on, and as Honda unlocked more potential from the engine in terms of power and reliability. But the problem for Williams was going to be McLaren. In 1984 they'd had the most dominant season on record, and in 1985 Prost had absolutely blitzed the competition, winning by over 20 points, which made up for the 1984 championship because he lost that season by just half a point. Not one, not two, but half. But heading into 1986, McLaren had started a bit of a fall-off and the other teams caught up. Rosberg left Williams, and coming in from Brabham was Nelson Piquet, who was already a two-time world champion. The thing is, the relationship didn't exactly get off to the best of starts, because Piquet, who was ever the wind-up merchant, called Mansell an uneducated blockhead and then had a crack at his wife's appearance, which he later apologised for when he was threatened by lawyers. But the Williams FW11 was a car that was better than what had come before. Still powered by the Honda V6 Turbo, it emerged early in the season as the car to beat, as Piquet won on his debut for the team in Brazil, but Mansell showed his championship potential by winning 4 of the next 8. But at the same time, the relationship was still sour. And for a good chunk of the season, Williams was without its founder Frank Williams, who had been involved in a car accident driving back from a test session at Paul Ricard. And testing in another country was very common in those days. Teams would rent out places like Paul Ricard, Jerez and other tracks in the region around the Mediterranean simply because the weather was going to be much nicer and more predictable than it would be in Britain. The smaller teams would group together and test together at Silverstone, splitting the bill, but if you're Williams, you had the money to spend those days and those pounds burning fuel, rubber and doing thousands of laps. Upon leaving the circuit to get back to Nice so he could catch his flight back to England, Frank was in a Ford Sierra rental car and believed he was going to be late for the flight home, so he was driving a bit too quick in a bid to make up the time. As it was, he never made it to the airport, because what had happened was, aside from forgetting which time zone he was in and that was the reason he thought he was running late, he rolled the car and was found upside down with neck injuries that caused him to be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. There's a picture of the crashed car on the internet, or at least it claims to be the car that Frank crashed, and you look at it and you think, well, it doesn't actually look too bad because the side he sat on hasn't been caved in as much as the other side. But then you remember that this was in France, so the steering wheel's on the other side, where the roof is completely caved in, and then you go, oh, yeah, he really did not stand a chance with all of that going on. I mean, the roof has just gone like that, right on top of his head. Nasty. But it's not the first time this has happened in a rather scary fashion, because Mansell had been doing a practice session for the French Grand Prix the year before where he suffered a puncture at 200 miles an hour and ended up in the wall with a concussion, and as a result had to sit out the race. When it comes to having massive shunts, I'm fairly certain that Mansell has had the most. But either way, it must have seemed like Williams in the south of France was cursed. And if you really want to delve deep into the whole stats thing, it had not long been the 10th anniversary of Graham Hill's plane crash, where Graham had been a team owner heading back after a test session at Paul Ricard. But thankfully, Frank lived, and he was back with the team in time for the British Grand Prix. But the thing is, in his absence, things seem to have gotten worse, with the relationships deteriorating all round. Because Piquet had assurances of X, Honda of Y, and Mansell of Z. Honda was paying Piquet's retainer, or at least most of Piquet's retainer, and they felt that Nelson, who was also a two-time champion, should be getting undisputed number one status, which is something that Nelson agreed with. As he would. If you're a two-time champion and you're being paid by the engine supplier, you'd want undisputed number one status too. Nelson was a bit hacked off that Patrick Head, who was the caretaker manager to borrow a footballing term, wasn't reining Nigel in during races, and this was allowing Mansell to start making a significant push to maybe taking the title come the end of the season. Now that was 6 or 7 months away at this point, but you never know. But Piquet did have his reasons to be annoyed. He was supposed to be number one and apparently had assurances from Frank that this would be the case. But by the time the British Grand Prix rolled around, Nelson had only won 1 race, while Nigel had won 3. But in the championship standings following the French Grand Prix, it was Alain Prost who was leading by just 1 single point from Mansell, 39 plays 38. Senna was 3rd on 36, and Piquet was a long way back in 4th on 23. 9 points for a win in those days, and 1 for 6th. And Piquet had failed to score at 3 races, retiring at Spain, Belgium and Detroit, while finishing 7th at Monaco. And the rules for 1986 were almost tailor-made for Prost because fuel saving was a big thing that year. The FIA had shrunk the fuel tanks down to about 195 litres, and fuel saving had to be done in the races to make the end, or at very least, turn the turbos right down, because the turbos by this point were absolutely astronomical figures. I mean, what are we at now? 4,000 in qualifying and 3.5 for the race? It just keeps going up, it's ridiculous. But Mansell's success over the season was rubbing Nelson the wrong way. Nelson told Playboy magazine he's argumentative, rude, and got an ugly wife. He's arrogant, and after he started winning races, he started treating everybody badly. Plus, he's written off piles of cars. No one wanted him to win. Now, as mentioned, he did retract those comments about Mrs. Mansell, but the comments he was making were only going to push the man known as Our Nige to try and beat him. Nigel Mansell, he's one of our own. No, really, he is. He's got a star on the Birmingham Walk of Stars. And I say he's one of our own, considering, you know, Flaggy McFlagface over there. My mum's from Hampstead, so technically. So when Frank came back for the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, he must have had quite the shock. In that race, Nigel had been wiped out in a massive collision at the start that was the career ender for Jacques Lafitte when he broke his legs in that accident. So for the restart, Nigel needed the spare car, which was set up for Nelson because of his number one status, or it was his turn to have it, but either way, the FW11 was set up how Nelson wanted it, in case he needed it. But Nigel was going to be put in that car instead, and he ended up winning that race. Nigel took the lead after Nelson missed a shift, and then a little bit later on in the race, he slammed the door in Nelson's face and then buggered off into the distance to take a very, very, very popular home victory. But afterwards, on the podium, the whole mood was frosty. They didn't speak to each other, they didn't shake hands, they didn't even look at each other. Because what effectively had happened is Nelson had just been beaten by his own car. But this is the problem with having two teammates squabbling. They're going to take points off each other because they're fighting too hard. This is why 2014 to 2016 Hamilton and Rosberg were able to go at it like they did. They had a close to 0 chance of losing the constructors, and the car was so far ahead of everybody else, they could just get away with it. Even when they had their clangs, one of them finished quite high up, with Barcelona 2016 being the only one where neither of them scored points after contact. Although that said, Austria could have gone a little bit differently. But the point remains, they were guaranteed a double. It's just which driver was going to win the driver's title. The Williams was the best car on the grid, and Frank had 2 very fast drivers, with Mansell mentioned as being the faster of the 2, but Piquet being the harder worker, with Nigel not putting in the work that he probably should have done. Nelson would be on the first plane to a test session, while Frank Durney recalls calling up Nigel, who would go, "I'm on the Isle of Man, I can't make it." But we can look at that in more detail in a "was he actually any good" type of video at another point. The Isle of Man. I wonder what it was that first attracted Nigel to that tax haven. After the British Grand Prix, Nelson won the next 2 races while Nigel was 3rd, with Piquet's countryman Senna slotting into 2nd on both occasions. but then they both retired at Austria, with Piquet losing his engine and Nigel his half shaft, which allowed Prost to take the win and make a little bit of a dent into the lead. Because of that retirement, Prost had come back into things, trailing Mansell by just 2 points. Mansell had 55 and Prost 53, but Piquet was still back on 48. Prost was then disqualified from the Italian Grand Prix, which Nelson won, taking points off Mansell again, but Prost scored 2 second places at Portugal and Mexico, while Mansell won Portugal, but was 5th at Mexico. But in races where Mansell retired, Prost won them, which means Nigel lost 18 points to Allen in this way. So that's how everything was set up for that showdown at Adelaide. So with all that points juggling out the way, the standings after Mexico were Mansell on 70, Prost on 64, Piquet on 63, and then a sample of the other drivers on there just for illustration purposes and extra information. You'll notice that I've put brackets on there, with Prost having 65 points and Mansell 72. This is because Prost dropped a point at Belgium and Mansell dropped Mexico, and it looks like the point that Prost dropped in Germany hasn't been applied yet, which it would be after the Australian Grand Prix. I think. This whole best X of Y championship thing is just a bit confusing. The permutations, however, were a bit simpler. Mansell could finish third behind Piquet and Prost, or Prost and Piquet, and still win the championship. If Prost wanted to win, it had to be a win with Mansell no lower than third, while Piquet needed to win the race with Mansell and Prost, ideally not finishing. Seems simple enough. Either way, it's going to be a three-way scrap for the championship. Mansell took pole by around 3/10, with Piquet second and Senna splitting the two Williams cars from Prost. The pace difference between the Williams and McLaren was evident, as the two Williams cars were around a second faster than the Frenchman, and Senna, who was undoubtedly the hot lap king, was able to get his Lotus 98T into third. And what a car that thing was! I mean, when it worked. Legitimately, if that Lotus was more reliable, we wouldn't be talking about Piquet and Mansell right now. But the Friday session was a weird one. It rained midway through the session, so really it was going to be Saturday where the times were going to be set. And for the most part, the Saturday times were what everybody used to line up on the grid. Except Johansson and Alboreto. Clearly. Mansell seemed to be taking things somewhat cautiously, probably just playing the long game knowing where he had to finish, and was helped out by Piquet spinning on lap 23, before getting another slice of fortune from his perspective because Prost got a puncture. After spinning, Piquet sliced his way through the field and overtook Mansell on lap 44 of the scheduled 82. And then with Prost recovering from his stop to replace the punctured tyre, the three contenders were running Piquet second, Mansell third and Prost fourth. But when Rosberg, who was leading the Grand Prix, got a puncture as well and had to pit, that scrap for second was now a scrap for the lead. And Prost had also overtaken Mansell just before Rosberg pitted, so now it was Piquet leading, Prost second and Mansell third. As it stood, Mansell was champion. And then, on lap 64, Murray exclaims, "And look at that! And colossally, that's Mansell!" That's the worst impression you'll ever hear, but I'm sticking to it. On the Brabham Straight, which headed up towards the famous hairpin, Mansell became the third front-running driver of the day to have a tyre fail on him, his left rear disintegrating at 180 miles an hour as he lapped Alliot's Ligier. The footage, the commentary, the sparks, all of it all adds up to one of those moments that's been a part of Formula 1 highlight reels since it happened. It was even used in the 1996 season review VHS tape as something that could have cost Hill the title at the showdown in Suzuka. But somehow Mansell kept the car under control and managed to get it to stop in the escape road at the hairpin, although he later joked that he should have crashed the car to bring out the red flag, thinking that if they stopped the race, he'd be classified third and would get enough through the half points rule to be given the championship, but it is what it is. Fearing the same thing happening to Nelson and seeing now that 3 drivers had suffered punctures, Williams pulled the safety card and brought in Piquet to get a fresh set of 4 tyres before sending him on his way. Over the remaining laps, he cut down the lead and finished 4 seconds off the race win. Prost ran out of fuel just as he crossed the line. Prost won through being in the right place at the right time to take advantage of everything else that was going on, as only Alain Prost could. In a season that had been dominated by the whole Williams teammate thing and the whole Nelson versus Mansell thing, it was kind of a through goes Hamilton moment. You had these two people squabbling, only for a third driver to come in and swoop through and, in this case, take the championship seemingly out of nowhere, which must have left Williams quite stunned. And Prost calls it his best title, even though a lot of people do call him lucky. Williams won 9 races of the 16 that year, with Mansell taking 5 and Piquet taking 4th, but Prost, with the same amount of wins as Piquet, ended up winning the championship. His results are more consistent than the two Williams drivers, and all the races that counted to Prost's tally were podiums. The 2 6th places he got at Belgium and Germany are removed from his tally, but Mansell also dropped 2 points because his Mexican Grand Prix result of 5th place is chalked off. But as you can see, there's still the 4th at Monaco and the 5th at Detroit, and that's how Prost was able to emerge out the other side of those 16 races as the champion. But Frank had won the Constructors, and that's what he cared about more. The rivalry continued into 1987, with Piquet this time emerging as the victor and, in a way, having the last laugh. While Mansell won 6 races in 87 and Piquet only won 3, it was Nelson that won the championship through consistency, and this despite having that monster shunt at Imola that on another day could have killed him. But he got out with only depth perception issues. Mansell, meanwhile, broke his back at Suzuka, which ended his championship, and like mentioned, I'll have to look at all of that in another video because how he was able to continue racing is something else. He won the 1992 championship with a broken ankle, and then he won the kart championship in 1993 with a broken freaking back. It's true, it's damn true. The 80s was dominated by the Prost and Senna rivalry that properly kicked off at the end of the decade, but Mansell and Piquet is up there too. It's certainly the most toxic rivalry Williams had, and it's rivalries like that one that say, yeah, you have 2 fast and hungry drivers, but at your own risk. Because if you lose the championship, it's your own fault for not reining those drivers in. Because only one of them can win the Drivers' Championship, and if they end up taking too many points off each other, then you won't win anything if other teams are too consistent. Which is why having 2 number 1 drivers only really works if you have a car like Red Bull did in 2023, McLaren in 88, or Mercedes in 2014, or even 2015 or 2016. But while the Senna and Prost rivalry seems to be the only rivalry that ever existed in Formula 1 because it's the only one that ever gets talked about, Mansell and Piquet is definitely up there and probably should get more attention. So then, a look at the rivalry through 1986 between Nelson Piquet and Nigel Mansell. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do give this video one of those thumb up things so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Assuming YouTube actually notifies you because some people haven't been getting them. But it's there if you want to. Massive thanks as always to the fine bunch of lads over on Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here or contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, then there's a link to Patreon down in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or the super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.